Hi, I'm David Reardon, and welcome to the Future of Christianity on Integral Life. Today, we're going to be talking to Father David McCallum, who's a Jesuit priest, among other things, but you will find a fascinating new voice within progressive Christianity, interested in leadership, spirituality, adult development. Got a doctorate from Columbia fairly recently, so this is going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. Welcome, David.
Thanks, David. It's good to be with you. Please call me David.
All right. Well, thank you. What I want to jump into now is really this question that we're holding within the integral community, which is, I call it the present and the future, even though we shorten it to the future of Christianity, or actually let's make it more personal, of being Christian. This is really where I'm starting to kind of shape this differently, because it is a personal experience that people are, as they try to form a vessel that is not the traditional church, although it is informed by that, certainly, and it may not be that rational rush that we get in college and other kinds of things, although it is informed by that, and then we sort of reconnect with spirit in a contemplative way, probably sort of a postmodern thing, and then what, right? Then the transcend and include, which all of those things actually come online. But forming a vehicle for Christian faith above that sort of that rational impulse that a lot of people get to is tricky business. I mean, particularly these days. At least this is what I'm hearing from everyone that is kind of lurching around after it, sort of saying, well, what does that mean? Right? So, but before we go there are two sort of things that I want to sort of set a context for this. One is that the two words, spirituality and religion, used a lot these days almost interchangeably. We see this a lot in the media when they just jump in and say, well, religion says, and most of the time they're talking about a traditional religion rather than even a modern religion, or religion versus science, right? And then, particularly when we get to postmodern, this word spiritual shows up again. And it's like, I'm a spiritual person, I'm a spiritual teacher. And then that word religion comes up and you go, people shudder because they go, are you talking about the church I rejected, or, however that's phrased. So let's just look at those two words. For you, briefly, what is for you the difference between the word religion and spirituality? And if they're related, how are they related?
Sure. So I would say when I think about religion, I often am helped along by a sociological point of view. So somebody like Durkheim would say that when a community has this primitive religious experience, it wants to create that again and again and again. And it creates a sort of set of rituals and practices that try to perpetuate that initial experience. So we think about the early Christian community. A lot of what we think of today as the church are attempts to reach back to what that early Christian community was, gathered around Jesus, and then specifically around the resurrected Jesus that was alive and active in that early community. The word religion actually means to reconnect, to that source. And so it's inevitably practices of community, of liturgical worship, of prayer. It's about methods. It's about conventions that are perpetuated and handed on for subsequent generations. There's a kind of standardization process that happens. And certainly, each individual religion will evolve given its contemporary context and the cultures in which it's being incarnated. At the same time, if a religion is connecting to its source in a healthy way, spirituality is part and parcel of that. But when there's and let's talk about what spirituality is. Spirituality is that, I think, felt experience of something more, something numinous, something of ultimate meaning. It is also a lens that helps us to see the world through a particular kind of set of values and helps to direct our attention in a kind of way. So I think a healthy religious tradition actually has lots of room for spirituality. And the church at its best has been host to a whole, intramural team of different kinds of spiritualities, the Franciscan, the Jesuit, the Dominican, the Carmelite, Benedictine, Trappist, each in their own way refracting a living part of this Christian tradition and doing it in a way that brings life and a sense of felt connection to God. Those who are really drawn to Carmelite spirituality will probably not be as drawn to Jesuit spirituality. You know, one is much more passive and contemplative, one is much more active and contemplative. Great that we have this kind of diversity. The challenge, I think, is when church and religion become overly identified with institution and practices and rites and rituals, as if those things alone are what a religion is. Spirituality can be dangerous. Most of the saints and mystics we think of, Ignatius, Francis, Teresa of Avila, they were not considered mainstream. They were reformers in their own time and very suspect from the view of the institutional church. Ignatius of Loyola, prior to his ordination and the founding of the Jesuits, was imprisoned 2 or 3 times by the Inquisition. There's something about that way of expressing the life and the spirit that we talk about in these distinct spiritualities that feels like a threat to the controls and to the sort of orthodoxy of the church itself. So I find that throughout history there's this process of kind of this flourishing of spiritualities, this clamping down of spiritualities, this flourishing, clamping down. And it's getting to the point where, you know, the church has much less control over what people are reading and thinking these days than it ever has before. People are getting access to this stuff, and it's filling them with excitement in life. Wherever they feel the church pushing back against it, I think they're opting to go with the spiritual more than the religious, because that's where the life is. The church at its best, at its most integral, at its healthiest, will be making lots of room that the spiritual is part and parcel of it. One of the things that happens, though, I think, and it's really common for folks who are going through that developmental phase where they're beginning to become self-authored, they're no longer living from scripts that are written from the outside in, but they're writing their own scripts. They're using their own experience as the benchmark for what they believe, for the choices they make, for the priorities that they are guided by. When that happens, when the church comes down too authoritatively, there's almost this instinct to push back against it. And if that means you lose the baby with the bathwater, that's what happens in many cases. So I think there's this exodus of well-educated adults, and the church is not quite sure what to do with that. You know, that's a real tragedy in a sense. The church has to make space for other adults, you know, within its numbers. It can't only focus on the youth, which is kind of a very current phenomenon, the focus on youth. So I don't know if that's...
So that's fine. So that leads me kind of into my next question, which is the sacred documents, right? So the Bible, but we know now that the Bible that was canonized, other scriptures are being found, discovered, you know, in dusty places or whatever, or somebody says, wow, look at this, there's a whole other book here by Mary Magdalene or something to that extent. So it's much wider than that. And we also don't have, my joke is that we don't have a cell phone movie of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Today we might. If that actually happened in the way that it's written about, it would be all over the world globally, and I would actually be able to see directly what Jesus had actually said or whatever happened there. But we don't have that. Most of the writings started at least 70 to 90 years after his death, which were interpretations of people that had been with him and perspectives now that we hold within Integral, that we understand that there are world views, and so there isn't just one view of these writings. And in fact, when we see them interpreted from a traditional standard, you talked about the other, you know, that traditional thing, and other is that, yes, we're all in this together except for all the people that aren't are other than us. And that's just dangerous, as we see a lot of the violence in the world comes from whoever the other is. It's not just Christianity. So then we go to modern and you say, well, here's the Jesus seminars, and what did he actually say, and do we have proof for this? And then that sort of a whole different sort of more rational inquiry. Then into postmodern of, oh my God, the women come online, right? And now we've got Mary Magdalene, and oh, this is like, or even Thomas,
African
and Thomas as well, right?
and
All that,
the liberation
right?
theologians and all these. Yep.
So when did you first come across the Bible, just briefly, and what did you think of it? And then sort of, how is your own development now? How do you hold it? I mean, where do the scriptures fit for you in terms of your level of comfort?
It's funny. I just had a memory of the illustrated childhood Bible that I had. Mm-hmm. And what was kind of cool about that was all the sort of violent pictures in the Old Testament. I thought, wow, this stuff looks really interesting and cool. Those stories from the Old Testament and then eventually into Jesus. Actually, the Old Testament was so much more colorful for a kid, a guy especially.
Great movies.
Yeah.
A lot of drama.
The New Testament seemed a little bit more mellow, a little more talky, actually. I don't think I was interested in that as a kid. High school comes along, we, on retreat, would look at different Bible texts. And from the Protestant tradition, the sort of priority given to the Word is so much greater than in the Catholic tradition, where you really have Eucharist as another focus. And I remember how serious the Bible study was for my Protestant friends. That didn't resonate with me at the time. Get into college, we're looking at it as a text, but I still have this feeling of something important and sacred there. And as I begin to pray with it, this is probably the first time I start to pray with it.
Yes.
Then I start to have experiences that I just can't explain. For instance, Ignatian contemplation is a practice of using imagination as we are reading the text, and to actually put ourselves into those scenes, to allow them to come to life, to trust that there's actually a real encounter with Christ, the risen Christ going on, that Ignatius believed that our imaginations were this amazing medium that God gave us, wherein to experience the Spirit alive, dynamic, challenging us, comforting us. I had experiences that blew me away, and a felt sense of Jesus as a person, as a living human person. That's very powerful. Not just this idea of this exalted Christ on a cross, distant and something to be worshipped, someone to be worshipped, but really a felt sense of him being a brother, a friend, as well as this divine reality that I couldn't grasp. So I think those experiences of using the scriptures in that sense during those college years really helped to open the way toward my willingness to enter religious life. Then studying theology.
Yes.
Well, it's hard to look at these texts. I had a few Bible classes at Harvard Divinity School and others at the Weston School of Theology. And great teachers. We were really lucky during those years to have folks who could open this stuff up and simultaneously hold the faith and the kind of critical perspective at once. But the emphasis was on the critical perspective. Seeing these as historically based documents, understanding the kind of very difficult editing process that went into them, the canonical process, which was very contentious. And I would say that it's hard to hold on to a sense of them being sacred in that same way. And along with the other parts of my religious crisis at that point, I felt like there was a way in which it becomes a text of poetry, of history, of wisdom teachings. It took a couple of years. I think of sitting in that uncomfortable relationship to it, and before I felt recaptured by the beauty of the scriptures, their insights, their power, beginning to preach about them. And, as an extrovert, when you're preaching, sometimes you're not aware of the feeling you have about something until you're actually saying it. Well, I'd be preaching about some of these stories, and I'd feel myself overcome with emotion like I was tapping into something meaningful at a level and layer that was not strictly rational.
Right.
It was something more existential. There was a truth quality that was actually recapturing me rather than me recapturing it, if that makes sense. The same thing I think has happened with Eucharist over the years, and discovering that this is no mere symbol. There is real transformation going on in the presence of the Eucharist and in my presence and the communal presence. That's very exciting. And I think in some ways it's a very hopeful thing for folks who are moving through those stages in their own development to stay open, that they too will be recaptured by the sacred, the numinous, the sort of mysterium tremendum quality of of these things, and especially within the context of a community. So kind of coming back to the religion and spirituality question, there is a way in which being in the context of a religious tradition, and for me it's also informed by the Jesuits, is to have principles and priorities that shape as reference points, my own individual experience. So my experience is never totally private. It's a personal experience that I have in relationship to a community. And in a sense, that kind of links to the quadrants. It's an experience that's interior, and yet it has reference points that are clearly part of a tradition and, an institution. And,
So, moving into this next, this is the theme that I hear a lot right now in folks that are interested in staying within the Christian faith. I mean, that there's a relationship with Jesus that has outgrown the traditional church. Most of the time there has been some reaction to that, saying I can't just go back and do it that way, and there are all kinds of reasons and so on. And then that modern sort of, I kind of went through that period, and then I found some contemplative tradition, and for a lot of people like me, we didn't even realize there was a contemplative tradition within Christianity. So you turn into Buddhism, Hindu, whatever it happens to be, but then eventually, if you keep looking around enough, you realize, yes, it's always been part of Christianity and so on. So you go through that experience where you have what you were talking about, this sort of direct opening up, this relation with God in a way that was a state experience, so that hasn't been the same, it wasn't the same as before. And once you have that, you can't put that genie back in the bottle either. It's welcome, certainly. But then this notion of the religion of one is that I'm out here, and yes, I have this lovely relationship with something larger than myself, but I'm also a human being that just naturally wants to, first of all, share that with other people, and to be social, and to have people push back, and to have spirit looking through other eyes back at me, and how all those evolutionary concepts that we fall in love with. So the long way around is that people are trying to find a way, a place, kinds of organizations, groups, not even that, types of things that they could join into where they can have the experience of the social without necessarily, and this, I don't want to blank all churches into the same thing, but I mean, without, their notion would be without going back to what I left, which was traditional. So where do you see that work? I mean, this weekend, Father Rohr talked a lot about this emerging church concept, and whether that's yours or not, but there was a bunch of things that he said about, here's some pulses of energy that are coming out of feminine theology and liberation theology and all that. So what's your view of that? And if I was asking you that question, if I was coming to you for counsel and saying, David, I need to hold this in a different way, where would you suggest I look?
I'm going to put this in the context of the Northern Hemisphere and the Western world, because I think that the church in its traditional forms is flourishing in all kinds of places and appropriate to the cultures in which it's situated. I think in the developed West and in the Northern Hemisphere, where there's a level of education and resources that's not available in these other places, there are a variety of movements that are beginning to emerge, and a lot of them are in response to what the church as an institution is either not offering or is pushing against. So, for instance, Richard's wonderful men's spirituality movement. I mean, it's very vibrant, and I know guys on Long Island who have been really transformed by this. people who come from all over the world, really, for that. Women's spirituality groups. I've worked in retreat houses where, women are finding this kind of voice and this place of expression for what it is to be a woman in relationship to Jesus in a way that's not bounded by the kind of parameters and limits of the Catholic Church. That's an uncomfortable reality. I think that women, and appropriately so, feel a good bit of anger about this feeling that they don't have a place where they can do that in a way that's accepted within the institution. And at the same time, maybe they're finding that voice in a way that's even more strong, more authoritative by taking those steps out. I have to say, though, I have a kind of bias, which I'll share with you. During the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, they decided that the church no longer could host their ideas, and they left, and they developed their own, marvelous traditions. And I can't help but feel like something was lost, because they left, because they stopped the conversation. Ignatius had a different way. He saw that the condition of the church was quite poor and corrupt at the time, that priests were not well educated, that so much reform needed to be taking place. But he chose to do it from within. And he chose to do it by doing things really well. So he founded a spirituality that was robust and engaging and transformative. He eventually, the Jesuits founded an educational system that was unprecedented in its breadth and in its engagement of the current times. That caused a sort of stir within the church and led to what we would think of as the CounterReformation. My own bias is that we not set up parallel churches in these emerging church movements, but maybe para-churches, groups within structures that are existing already that can fertilize and catalyze life and energy because of what they're doing. Not because they're leaving, but because they're staying. Right. And, I see it as I go into Starbucks or other coffee houses and I see men studying the Bible in groups. That's mostly the evangelical movement doing that. How marvelous that it's putting the Bible into these men's hands and saying, what difference does this make in your lives? And you have the capacity to discern and really understand where God's leading you. And to do that as a group, as a community, not as individuals. To see, for instance, base communities or Christian life communities that are really fed by a specific spirituality, and they say, well, we've done this retreat experience, but now we want to keep making the connection between our life and our work and our spirituality. And they're doing that in ways that are vibrant and authentic. So I really applaud and really encourage that kind of development and the diversity of groups that are doing that kind of thing. And I'd say, stay close to your tradition and keep working at giving something back. Not because you think you're better, but because you're experiencing something beautiful that you want others to have a share in. In a sense, it's to do the transcend and include movement that Integral describes in terms of development by not pushing back so hard against what we're leaving behind, those earlier stages of our religious development, but really seeing ourselves there and loving ourselves and that other. And I don't know if this is making sense, but it's a harder work than it is to step outside.
Yes, yes. So one last sort of inquiry. Where do you personally, when we hold the future of the Christian faith or being Christian, sort of briefly, what do you think, what are the biggest challenges that you see? And then where's your hope?
Yeah. Well, I must say, given the current conditions in the world, I'd say that one of the greatest contributions Christianity can make to the Integral movement is to keep focused on service and the mission to the poor, and to being agents of some kind of transformative justice in the world. I think this is a part of the Christian tradition which is so close to the core. It's right there in that Sermon on the Mount which you referenced. And yet we constantly turn our attention to other things, to who's in and who's out, and to rituals and practices and codes and orthodoxy. But it all comes back to that. How do we relate to our neighbor? How do we relate to the person who's marginalized? If there's going to be a future for Christianity, it's because we get back to that foundation. Another is that it's not about identity politics. It's not about delimiting the sort of boundaries of, who's in and who's out and who can and cannot come to communion. I believe that it is very much about helping people have a direct relationship with God through Christ, and facilitating that, getting out of the way in a sense, and encouraging people's direct experience. Then the church has a future because the Spirit's going to be at work in it. Not because we're shoring up institutions and building endowments and, firming up old buildings. It's going to be a matter of how we relate to the future in faith, more so than through our institutional buildings. Not that those things are not important, but they're not. It would be a mistake to make those first.
Yes.
So I'd say those are some of the keys. The other thing is, as we look at this, the bifurcation of different religious communities around really neuralgic points, abortion, for instance, or homosexuality, these things really have to be put into a different light. They're very important issues, and it would be a mistake to not think thoughtfully and carefully about what our tradition has to say about them. But they've become distractions from, I think, the core issues of what Jesus is teaching and preaching about, which is essentially life across the board, and no fear of death. So anyway, I think I'm kind of rambling a bit, but my hope for the future is that more and more of us will awaken to the ordinary mysticism of our lives and to God's activities in our lives, and that we'll do that more and more as one human community, to see Christ in somewhat of a trans-Christian way.
Yes.
So might be a bit daring to say that, but I think that's where I'd like to see us go.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, David, for sharing the sort of what I hope is the first of many conversations as you and we, take this journey into sort of present and future of being a Christian. It was very informative.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, and a privilege to do this. So thanks very much.